So what I want to really emphasize here is why study the telegraph, not just in the American context, but in the context of any location. Let me just check real quick. I see some hand raises. Aha. I'm going to pause. Can people hear me?
I think most of them can.
Okay. Okay. All right. So when we talk about the telegraph today, what we're going to do is we're going to really focus on the relevance of telegraph for economic historians. And we're going to think about this in three broad categories: impact of telegraph access itself, telecommunication and government, which is going back to some of the earlier questions about how do you work with new technology with pre-existing institutions, and also the issue of market power. You can't talk about telecommunications without a discussion on, is this a natural monopoly? And if so, how do you handle it? So what is a telegraph? I want to make sure everyone here is familiar with a telegraph. Telegraph is going to transmit message, and the message is going to move faster than if you were to physically move it. Meaning if you were to write that message down and hand it to someone, you can move faster than that. So that someone could be on a train, they could be walking, they could be on a boat. A telegraph is going to be faster. It's going to transmit the message in a different medium. The medium, there's two main types. There's initially what's called an optical telegraph. So you've seen one right here. And the way optical telegraphs work is that doohickey up there, those two little arms, it spins around, changes positions, and somewhere someone has made a book that says, depending on what position those arms are held in, it means either a letter or a word. Optical telegraphs were very common around ports to signal the arrival of ships before they actually made it to dock. Now, that was the most popular private use of them. But if you're looking for a large network that covers across great expanses of land, those are predominantly constructed by governments for military purposes. Napoleon's was probably one of the most famous, where he constructs one that sort of originates out of Paris as the hub that travels across the country. Optical telegraphs are going to have some drawbacks. If you have a code book, you can read it. So if that message is a little personal or private, if someone really wanted to, they could figure it out. They're also constrained. You have to see them. These stations are maybe like 10, 20 miles apart, which, if you want to convert that to kilometers, that would be about 24 divided by 3 is 8. About a little less than 40 kilometers. Notice it's going to involve a lot of labor because each station has to have a person that's going to be there reading the other station, and another person sending a message on to the next station. Later on, we have the electric telegraph. Right there, you've seen a picture of what's known as a Morse key. And what the electric telegraph is able to do is it's able to make a monotone sound or a click, depending on what the receptor is doing for a Morse machine. Electric telegraphs are cheaper. You can send the wires farther apart, needing less people between them. They're faster. The message is private. No one can look at the wire and see what's being sent. And in their applications, they generally provide more service to the public. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't built for military purposes. That will vary a lot from country to country. Some places, telegraph construction, using electric telegraph, is very much about military uses. But in other places, especially the United States, Great Britain, Canada, the telegraph has started as a business to make money servicing people who want fast messaging. So let's talk about where the telegraph is going to have an impact. It's going to impact trade, going to facilitate more trade in some cases, or maybe better put, more efficient trade. It's going to lower production costs, but it's also going to impact your society in terms of societal behaviors. So let's talk about trade. And here we're going to highlight Steinwinder work as well as Juan's. They do a lot of work looking at cotton shipments. And one of the big things telegraphs are good at doing is helping with market integration. If I grow cotton in the United States and I'm primarily selling my cotton to manufacturers in the United Kingdom, then the price in the United Kingdom is very important in driving my business decisions. In the mid-19th century, there's an underground telegraph line, which we call cables, built roughly from New York to London. And that dramatically lowers the speed of time to transmit information about what prices are in the United Kingdom. And so if you're doing a standard price convergence discussion, you're going to see that the prices of cotton are going to start converging in the United States and the United Kingdom when you look at the large cotton markets. And you would expect this in any industry. So there's other work out there looking at the price of gold, looking at the price of railroad stocks. These markets are now becoming more integrated. Now, the big contribution I want to point here that was recently made is that for some people, when they saw this market integration, they thought, well, is it really that important? Because it's not like there was a large lag between these markets. Was it already good enough? And what they were able to show is that once prices were becoming updated much more frequently and quickly, cotton producers started changing their shipments of cotton faster to changes in prices in the United Kingdom. And so now we're having real changes in economic activity because of telegraph access. Now, the reason why I said efficient is that I didn't say that we increase cotton trade. I said that cotton producers either increase or decrease their exports to the United Kingdom more rapidly in reaction to the price of cotton. So that means they're not sending cotton to the United Kingdom that they really don't want. And it means when there's a big desire for cotton in the United Kingdom, they're expanding their exports. But there's also a question, does telegraph improve trade? Meaning, in this case, increase trade. In the trade literature, there's a lot of barriers to trade, and you might be used to hearing about some with government barriers, tariffs, quotas, rules and regulations. Now, tariffs and quotas are traditional trade barriers. Rule and regulations, we're starting to get into non-tariff trade barriers. And that also can include transaction costs to trade. So one of the things that we're able to figure out, that they're able to figure out, is that if you are able to get telegraph access, it actually increased trade in some goods. And the goods that we saw increased trade in were in standardized goods. And they argue that's because standardized goods, like cotton thread, you can tell a producer in a couple words exactly what you want and they can deliver it. But when we look at custom goods, so over here we have cotton cloth on the other side of the screen. Cotton cloth comes in a variety of colors. It comes in a variety of weights. It comes in a variety of stitches. There isn't a very good way to communicate that just with words. You really need to see samples of the product to make sure they're producing the exact cloth you want. And so in those non-standardized goods, having the telegraph access does not increase trade. So we mentioned telegraph increases trade or improves trade's efficiency, what we're saying here. But telegraph can also help lower the cost of production. And there's 3 big ways that we're going to highlight it can do that. It can improve the allocation of capital, machines. It can improve the management of inventories. And it can improve the provision of information. So we're going to look at railroads as an example of improved capital allocation. Railroads have to manage moving trains along same paths. That can create bottlenecks. That can create accidents if you aren't careful. The closer you can run trains without them crashing into each other, the more trains you can run, the more you can get out of your investment. Especially on single track railroads, which are very popular in the United States. And having access to a technology that could send messages faster than the movement of your trains, that now allows you to say, train 42 has passed, it's safe for train 43 to proceed. It's allowing you to say, if you have a problem, a tree fell on the track, send someone to come cut it up. So it's allowing us to better coordinate on the track we have. So we're using that track to its most efficient use, both in reducing its downtime and being able to put more throughput on the track. It's allowing us to resolve problems faster. It's allowing us to move things where they are needed. That may not necessarily be just density on track, but also my train engine is not working well. Send me a new engine so I can keep moving this train later on in the day. So now you're starting to shift resources, whether it's particular types of engines, cars, personnel, to keep the railroad running as best as it can. So that's the idea of improving allocation of capital. The other big way telegraphs are really useful in terms of affecting production is improvement in the management of inventories. Management of inventories isn't just about lowering cost of inventories. Management of inventories also can allow different types of production. So when we look at the meat packing industry in the United States, prior to the telegraph, you have a bunch of smaller meat packing plants, slaughterhouses, near the cities where they'll be consuming the meat. And that's in part because you have to think about how you're going to store meat until it's consumed. And one way you can think of storing meat is that as long as the cattle is alive, the meat isn't going to spoil. But once you slaughter that cattle, you have a finite amount of time until that meat's no longer good to eat. So without the telegraph, you ship your cattle to the meat packing facility in the town it's going to be consumed in, and you're sort of using the cattle there as your storage, but that's going to limit the size of that facility. With the telegraph, you can have a large meat packing plant, likely in Chicago, and you can have distribution houses at a variety of cities, and the telegraph can send information to the meat packing plant. Here's our current inventory count. Here's how much more meat we have. So you're going to coordinate that distribution of meat to those locations. You're getting information what the demand is for meat. And now you're able to, because you know that information, you don't have to worry about the meat spoiling on the way because you have ideas of what the consumption patterns are. You're able to have these larger facilities, and there's benefits to these larger facilities. There's parts of animals that are useful if you have enough of them in one place. And with these larger facilities, you can start producing additional products. Now, this inventory management isn't just about at the meat packing plant itself, but it's also about the cattle coming in. Land in Chicago is not cheap. If you could make sure you're not bringing in too much cattle, you can run your cattle yard, the cattle yard where you're storing the cattle, more efficiently. You can say, hold off on sending cattle. We don't need more right now. Or you can say, right now, we have a lot of customers. Let's bring in more cattle into Chicago so we can keep up with demand. And then you have some businesses where their entire business is information. Newspapers are there to provide people with information. It's a form of entertainment that people are willing to pay for. Telegraph's going to do a couple things for them. It's going to allow them to collect stories faster. I don't have to wait a few weeks to get correspondence from New Orleans anymore to New York City. I can get that within the day. But also, what's important, maybe even more important for the newspapers, is that it allows the newspapers to push out their stories once they're written across a wide area very fast. In the United States, we did this through what are called press associations. Probably the most famous is the New York Associated Press. And what you can do is you can write a single story that's going to be published in newspapers across the United States. And when you send out the story, all you have to do is you arrange for certain time periods where everyone's going to receive their news from the New York Associated Press, who is a member of the Associated Press or is a recipient of their material by contract. And you can have a single person put that information on the wire, the telegraph lines, and they all can hear it at once, and they all can put it in their local newspapers, wherever they may be at. Now, newspapers are not the only information-driven business. You can think of other ones. Credit scores could be an information-driven business. Assessing the quality of banks can be an information business, especially in a country like the United States, where for a long time, banks are not insured. So you have to be very conscious as a depositor on whether or not the bank was going to would be solvent, stay in business.
So I have a
yes.
question.
Go for it.
So you mean that telegraph also brought a lot of changes to other industries, or maybe led an information revolution to like banking and newspaper industries?
Banking, newspaper, industrial production, resources, and it can show up in weird ways too. You could argue that the telegraph makes it possible to expand foreign markets. So the export of American meat to Great Britain is in part economical because they're able to operate these larger scale slaughterhouses. Which means you now have additional cargo that's part of the carriage on Bash ocean liners that contribute to paying the fixed cost of that industry. You have a variety of spillover effects that you may not anticipate because of the things that it makes available that weren't there. And there are a lot of opportunities to study because it's really hard sometimes to figure out how to quantify these uses. So there's a lot of opportunity, if you can think of a good use, to really look at the study and see if someone's already worked on it or not. If they haven't, to then go through the questions of whether or not you have the information to find out. But a challenge with the telegraph is that you have to have certain information to really test whether or not it had an impact. And you have to be very creative. To test the speed of the telegraph and its effect on trade, they had to come up with a way to measure telegraph speed. And they were actually able to use Lloyd's of London's internal magazine, because that magazine was always being updated with information on boats and when they arrived at ports. And they were able to use that magazine, which was regularly published, to see how long it took information from particular ports to be moved from that location to London. And they could compare it to the date when the ship was in that port. So that built them a really unique data set of telegraph speed that allowed them to compare the impact of faster speeds of telegraph communication on trade. But you have to have that sort of creative mind to find opportunities to really study impact telegraph. I mean, the great thing about the telegraph, prior to the telegraph, there isn't a way to move messages this fast. People have talked about the impact of the internet. People have talked about the impact of telephones, but the changes when those technologies came online are magnitude smaller than when the telegraph comes online. Now, the United States, prior to the completion of the overland telegraph, it took you half a year to send a piece of mail from New York City to San Francisco. With the telegraph, it now took a couple of days. That's a dramatic change in information transmission that has, if information is going to matter in changing what people are going to do, you're not going to get much better changes in terms of magnitude of information than you are in studying the expansion of a telegraph network. So telegraph is not only affecting business, it's affecting social behaviors. Especially when, place where you can see this really well is in collective action. I'm going to highlight two examples of collective action. So we're going to highlight protesters in America. So this is the temperance movement. The temperance movement did not like the consumption of alcohol. And they would organize marches, and they would organize, let's go into a bar and destroy all their alcohol. And one of the things that has been learned by Uriman, Iglesias, and Garcia Dimo is that the telegraph helped organize these sort of protests. That if you lived in a town near another town which had a temperance movement protest, and you were connected to each other by railroad and the telegraph, it increased the probability you were going to have a protest in your town. And the effect was particularly strong when you have both telegraph and railroad access. And they were able, because we talk about data issues, about being able to identify, they are able to take advantage of doing a data set of interruptions in service for railroads and the telegraph to really identify the effect of both technology. Now, you don't want to assume, though, that having telegraph access means you're going to have more protests. That's not necessarily true. You know, when you're doing telegraph research, you really have to think about how the telegraph is going to be used. So Michael Weaver has done all this work on telegraph access impact on lynching in the American South. And he really emphasizes in his work that places with more news coverage in the South see a decrease in lynchings, and that the places that are going to have more news coverage are going to be places that also have more telegraph access. And he's going to argue that telegraph access is going to cause the increased news coverage, and that news coverage is going to cause a decrease in lynching, based on the idea that if there's more news coverage where you are at, you personally are more likely to be exposed and being involved in lynching. And it's also more likely, from a government perspective, your town local lynching event is going to get covered in regional and national newspapers outside your region and make your town look bad. So it's not necessarily true that telegraph access is always going to be about increasing social unrest. It could actually go the other way too, but you have to be very conscious about the entire story when you look at that. So now we're starting to get into where I start coming into these discussions, because before we were talking about other people and their work and why we care about the telegraph. My role, I have two main roles in the telegraph. One of my big roles is if you want to know where telegraph stations are located in North America, you're probably going to be talking to me. I have been working with groups of people to create GIS maps of US telegraph stations. Now, North America is particularly challenging for identifying telegraph locations compared to other countries, because we're one of the few places in the world where our telegraph system is predominantly provided by private companies, by businesses. If you go to other parts of the world, the norm is usually that the telegraph is provided by some form of government entity. And so in those parts, you can usually go to your government archives, and in their archives, they'll have books preserved on where telegraph stations were located. But in the United States, that doesn't exist. The post office did not provide telegraph service, except for a short period during World War I, where they did a really bad job and the telegraph companies were given back to the private businesses. Outside of that period, telegraph service is done by private companies, and private companies are not necessarily thinking that they need to preserve everything for a government record. They're a business. So I've been working very hard with Michael Weaver for after the years 1866, and then with Bitsy Perlman and Tiene Wong on telegraph locations prior to 1866, using a variety of sources. There are tariff books out there that companies would give to their employees to let them know when they had customers where they could send messages. There are telegraph maps out there that were periodically distributed so that people might have a visual to see where they could send a message. And there are telegrams, which is the physical piece of paper that you would have received if you were getting a telegraph message, that sometimes include promotional material that include the location of offices. And using all those sources together, I've been working with all these wonderful people to construct GIS maps of telegraph locations so that people are in positions where if they want to answer some of the questions we talked about or additional questions, they have the information to do that research. Now, here's an example. You're seeing a map right now of Western Union telegraph offices in 1874. Now, you're going to notice that the map also includes telegraph prices. I'm using that map with telegraph prices from 1887 to show people how much it would cost to send a message to New York City from those locations. Now, your first reaction should be, why are you using an 1874 map to talk about telegraph prices in 1887? And that gets back to the data issue. Because these data points weren't being preserved systematically, we don't have year by year exact information on where telegraph offices are located. For pre-1866, we're hoping to be able to produce a map for 1840, 1850, 1853, 52, 1860. No, that's like once every 10 years. And that's because the information to do something more detailed isn't there. Now, since I made this map, I have located more documents, so I will be able to make later time periods of offices than what you're currently seeing. But that's the project that I'm currently working on. That's a big part of what I'm doing to help in the North America application do research on the impact of the telegraph. But the other big part that I'm really involved with is talking about the role of telecommunication in government. We've already talked about why the telegraph is important. But now if something's important, how does it get provided for? So who's going to provide the telegraph service? How do we make sure that provision of telegraph services is going to be efficient? And as we're going to finish up, we have to talk about monopoly and market power, which again is probably going to involve a discussion involving government. So when we think about who provides telegraph services, we're going to have to deal with a couple of issues. We're going to think about the issue of government expropriation, which means the government's going to take over the business, it's going to run it. And we're going to think about whether or not we want public governments running your telegraph system versus private businesses running your telegraph system. So government expropriation is a really critical thing to think about when you think about the telegraph, because it has a very large fixed investment. Right there, those poles, those are telegraph poles. On top of them are telegraph wires. For the most part, that investment is sunk. Probably easier to get new poles and take those ones out of the ground to build a new line. Not necessary. I mean, it depends how far you're moving and how scarce wood is. But the bigger challenge is that because you have so much fixed investment, fixed infrastructure, that's easy for the government to see, and it's hard to move or hide it, it's really easy for the government to expropriate it. And this creates problems for business, because that means you're in a more risky business. And it's not just a telegraph that faces this. Natural gas companies, water companies, all of these companies have large fixed infrastructure that cannot be easily moved. And since they can't hide it from government, for say some other businesses, if the government is getting in the way of the business, too bad, you're stuck. You can't do much about it. The government wants to take it, too bad, you're stuck. They can see everything you have. And that gets into the issue of whether or not you have public versus private operation. Troskin will tell you there are some industries in the United States where we don't have private operation by businesses because it was just too risky that the government was going to expropriate it from the business. So no one wanted to get into that industry. But that's not the only public versus private operation discussion you have to worry about. Do you have a right to communication? In the United States Post Office is in the US Constitution as being something the government should be involved in. Is the telegram its own thing, or is it an extension of the post office? So now we're getting back to the discussion about the importance of institutions. The post office pre-exists prior to the telegraph. If you view that there's a lot of externalities, bonuses from telegraph access, you might argue that you want government operation because the private companies are not going to receive adequate enough payment for all the good things they're providing to your economy. The other thing to worry about when you're involving this kind of government is, are telegraphs a natural monopoly? And if they're a natural monopoly, there's one set of ideas out there that one way you can deal with a natural monopoly is you could have the government run it, operating as what's best for society than what's best for a monopoly, which would not be the best for society. Now, hopefully, you've had a chance to talk about some of the flaws in that sort of logic, because they're making a lot of assumptions about how well a government can run a business. So, it's possible that the way your government would structure, it may not be good at running a business. United States, we're a democracy. And that means that when you have people managing businesses for the government, their supervision comes from people who will check on them every once in a while, but then they have other problems to deal with that are not related to that business. And so it's not unusual for government-owned enterprises in the United States to not be operating as well as they should be because they're not being supervised as well as they should be. And so that becomes an additional complication.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So just now you mentioned that during World War I, the private operators, what was that story? I was wondering if the state had more incentive to expropriate telegraph, if the private companies failed to operate the industry during the wars, and also for national security concerns, the state may need the telegraph system to transmit the messages.
And the great thing about World War I, for a lot of those questions, is basically we saw the government takeover of the US telegraph system fail. It got worse under government running. I mean, those are all definitely concerns. Those things were brought up. But a key part in the US context was that the United States Post Office saw the telegraph system as a competitor. And they used World War I and some of those arguments as an opportunity to try to nationalize it for their own control. And so in the practical side, I think some of those arguments you brought up were brought up in the public space, but a lot of the arguments that were brought up are from an earlier debate where the post office says, this is a right. Communication is a right. We can do this better as a government agency than private businesses can. So you should put the telegraph in our hands, and we will do a better job than private companies. We'll do it for lower price than private companies. We'll give you more stations. And then when they actually took it over in World War I, they closed telegraph stations, they provide worse services, prices went up, and costs went up too, because because of the politics, they got involved in some union labor contracts that they signed that the private telegraph companies would never sign. So in many respects, for the US context, World War I actually became a good experiment to show that maybe the US government is not a good place to provide telegraph service. You maybe not want a public option in the United States. And it's great because it gets really bitter, because they're also trying to get some of the managers involved from the private companies to help them make it work. And a lot of these managers are very bitter, especially since there's multiple telegraph companies in the United States. And some of the things the post office is doing is, in the long term, if they were to get their businesses back, would make them less competitive with their competitors. And so they're not cooperating. And so when they're having trouble, for example, with the international cables on one set of this network, managers in the other set of the network who are not having trouble, they're going to say, no, we're not going to help you out because those cables are part of the infrastructure of our competitor. Why do we want to strengthen our competitor if there's a chance we might get this back in the future? Because they're politically fighting over this as well. And the post office is bitter enough that they just fire all of those people, kick them out of their offices. But like I said, the concerns you brought up are real concerns, and they're concerns you see in our countries, especially when we look at Great Britain and international cables. They're very concerned about their ability to manage information flows during international crisis. Guys, it was World War I or World War II, but they made a point to cut the German cables underneath the oceans so that Great Britain would have more control over diplomatic messages between Europe and all the countries in the Western Hemisphere, be it the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina.
Yeah, I also wonder if the private companies had an incentive to sell the information of great importance to, to the enemies, if the enemies paid a lot of money to them, and such issues.
I mean, I've not seen any examples of that within the records of the US telegraph companies. I mean, the US telegraph companies are all relatively big. So how valuable would that have to be to another country for them to be willing to pay for it to justify a US company taking that risk? I mean, that has to be some gigantic payoff, because these are not small companies. I mean, they're some of the largest companies in the United States in this time period, especially since they're one of the few companies in the United States that are present across the entire country. So in a weird way, not that I thought about this before, but in a weird way, because they are so large, the probability of them actually doing that goes down. Plus, I mean, if you're talking about special international messages, all governments are taking precautions, whether you're using your own government cables or you're using private cables. So, I mean, even if the telegraph company is doing their best to not disclose information, there's always a chance that someone's going to tap a wire somewhere. And so, you're using various coding mechanics to hide what you're saying. But I mean, that also starts speaking to the technology as well. The technology to intercept messages are not as sophisticated in the time period I'm looking at than today, where you can automate a lot more of that stuff. I mean, even though this is a high fixed cost industry, we have a lot of labor involved. There's a lot of things that we do automatically in our communication networks now that have to be done by hand. Now, at a certain point, you can't, the signal and the message gets weak enough, it has to be retransmitted. And for a long time, that had to be physically done by a person. You didn't have a machine that could automatically do that for you. For a very long time, beyond that, you can't just put a message in a black box and it ends up at the right destination. The messages have to be sorted by people. So if I'm sending a message to from Bethany, West Virginia to Kansas City, I'd probably go down to my local telegraph office, which would probably be like Wellsburg, West Virginia. They would send that message to Pittsburgh. Someone would physically have to write that message down. And then they would probably have to send it to some place like either Chicago or St. Louis, where someone else would receive that message, so in our city, and then they'd have to physically sort it, and then to someone who then would forward it on to my final destination. So that world, in a sense, is very different than ours today, because we're still in an era when you said the word computer, it meant a physical person and not a machine. And you could argue that the early computers that do exist, that are used to break things like the Enigma machines, are attempts to find solutions to the problems that exist in this era, and if you wanted to break coded messages with some of the technology that's being used. So the other thing you have to consider about when you talk about the public versus private operation is you also worry about rent seeking. Rent seeking is the idea that you're going to be using government to benefit one group of people at the expense of another without generating economic value. Person on there on the right, that's Samuel Morse. Samuel Morse has the patent for telegraph technology in the United States. And when he first developed it, he tried selling it to the US government with the idea that the US government could develop it. And he was looking for a giant payout. When you're in the moment of the time period, if you're a government official, you would get a new unproven technology. Am I really getting a bargain that I can provide to the people? Or is this some random person looking to take advantage of the government and get a large buyout? And even if the technology works, are these buyouts by the government actually paying the real value for it, or are we overpaying? The area we're going to see rent seeking. Whether you have public or private providers, the people who are going to consume the telegraph may be seeking preferential treatment. You can see this really well in the United Kingdom, where a lot of the lobbyists for the eventual nationalization of their telegraph system in the late 1860s, they're pushing for it because they're trying to get preferential treatment for telegraph services for themselves at the expense of others, which likely made the British telegraph system less efficient than the North American telegraph system. You have issues of outright monopoly grants from government. This is particularly an issue in the United States. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But people saying that you're the one telegraph company, and they're doing that not to necessarily improve service, but because that monopoly grant benefits the company, they're gaining a rent, and it can benefit certain individuals within government. And sometimes it can benefit a local government at the expense of everyone else around them. And then the other push we have rent seeking, which we've already mentioned, is that you have competitors who don't want to deal with the telegraph, the post office. The post office in the United States was not very successful at blocking private competitors compared to other countries. Now you can compare this with France. France controlled the telegraph. France controlled a lot of things in their post office that would be surprising in the United States. So in France, if you were riding a train and you had luggage, the luggage car was operated by the post office. Why? Because the post office was afraid that if they didn't operate the luggage cars, someone else would, and then they would use those luggage cars to also deliver packages and letters in competition with the post office. And you might say to yourself, well, that sounds crazy. But I can tell you that was not, because that's exactly what happened in the United States. And that's, we have a bunch of companies historically that did that. Wells Fargo, American Express. All of them were originally delivery companies and not financial companies. So this complicates the public versus private owner operation discussion. But if you're going to have private operation, how do you have efficient provision of telegraph services? Telegraph is a network industry. And then once you're going to be a private operator, some of those uncertain legal questions that we were talking about earlier, they become even more important, because without resolving them, they become entry barriers to the provision of telegraph services. And those entry barriers can affect a wider number of consumers than you may initially expect. So what do I mean by network industry? So we have triangle, circle, and square. Let's assume right now that triangle and circle are already on the telegraph network. If we were to add that square to the telegraph network, we're not just adding one more route. We're adding two more routes. Circle to square, triangle to square. And every time we add an additional location, the number of routes we're adding keeps growing. That, in some part, favors larger networks, because the bigger my network is, the more competition I can have, or the more service I'm trying to cross a variety of locations. So some people, when they look at network industries, they just instantly think natural monopoly, because it's really hard to basically pay that fixed cost to build a network. Myself, when I think of the telegraph as a network industry, I think of it as also as competition can increase dramatically just from one additional route, because that's not just one additional route. So one more office isn't one additional route. It is all your other offices adding an additional route. But if you're going to have this network industry to thrive, if you're going to build this network, you have to deal with your uncertain legal environment. You have to deal with the institutions. You have to get permission to operate. You have to worry about legal liabilities, worry about property rights. You have to worry about how you're going to handle transmission between companies. You have to worry about taxes. These are not questions that are readily solved. When you first start a telegraph company, you have to ask yourself, can I even start a telegraph company? A lot of locations, especially under the English common law traditions, have rules about how you start a business. Do you have permission to provide that service? You might have the niftiest, greatest, newest technology in the world, but you may not have legal permission to do it. What's your legal liability? If you're handling messages for the financial markets, and because your message is late and someone loses $2 million, do you owe that person $2 million? Is my infrastructure going to be protected? I mean, if you're building a fixed infrastructure industry like the telegraph, you have miles, thousands of kilometers of wires and poles just lying out there. You can't necessarily constantly patrol them all, If someone destroys your property, are you protected? You do have people who will cut down wires. Am I required to exchange messages between companies? What taxes do I have to pay? Who has tax jurisdiction over me? These are all uncertainties that can negatively impact your business and negatively impact your willingness to provide service. And these inefficiencies can have large effects even if they occur in a small location. So these two stars here represent two different destinations for a message. And those boxes represent three different local governments. And the shortest, most direct route between those locations involves passing through that gray box in the middle. It may be that the two boxes on the outside have great, wonderful telegraph regulations. But that box in the middle could completely destroy the project. The rules, the laws, the costs imposed by that box in the middle imposes costs on the entire network and can result in not just people potentially not providing telegraph services in that gray box, but people not providing telegraph services in this entire area. If you want to visualize this, we're looking right now at the East Coast of the United States. And we're looking at New York City and the Washington, D.C., the city of Washington. And that blue line you see, that is the shortest route which goes through Maryland to connect New York City to Washington. If Maryland said, no, you can't go through us, or they impose costs that made going through them so high that it was not worth doing it. Maryland's a state, a level of local government. There's a level below them as well. Then your alternative is you have to go around Maryland. And that white line is the shortest route on land to go around Maryland. Now, like I said, it may sound crazy if you're used to US history to say that a state might prevent someone from crossing it. But that actually is not an unfeasible idea. The state of Nevada sold a monopoly right to a single telegraph company to provide telegraph services across the state, which meant at that time period, they had sold a monopoly right to connect the state of California to the rest of the United States with telegraph services. Maryland and Pennsylvania had a bitter war over whether or not certain railroads could cross their states. And Maryland had a beef with Pennsylvania where they tried to block a railroad based in Pennsylvania from crossing state in to get to Washington. So Maryland has a precedent of doing something like this. But now, this isn't just, if they were to do something, this doesn't just affect the state of Maryland. It affects the District of Columbia, a completely separate political entity. It affects New York City. It affects locations to the south of Washington. It affects locations to the north of New York. These rules, these barriers have impacts beyond just the location where they're at. They create inefficiencies on their neighbors. So when we talk about monopoly market power, when you have governments, especially when you have governments with multiple layers, in the United States, we have the federal government, we have a state government. Underneath the state government, we have a variety of local governments. Sometimes we have a local government within our local government. You can have these lower levels of governments create local laws that create market power, which can contribute to the lack of competition, which can contribute to the lack of telegraph access, and undermines market preserving federalism, which is a way of trying to have the best economic policy for your institutional setups. But I want to emphasize that while these challenges exist, competition is possible in this industry. Now, there are accusations because of network effects that you don't see competition in private provision telegraph. And I can reassure you, there is competition within the provision of telegraph services in the United States. That even though there is a high sunk cost, there is still competitive pressure within the industry. So that doesn't mean there isn't time periods where there's lack of competition. Right here, we're looking in June of 1866. Those states in gray, so this is a map of the United States. Those states in gray are the only states in the United States which has a competing telegraph company that can get a message to New York City that is not the Western Union Telegraph Company. But 1866 is an important year because in 1866, we are going to look at a time period where a lot of these local entry barriers, which have these great inefficiencies across the larger network, are going to be dismantled by the US federal government. And we're going to discover that in the time period after, you're regularly going to see across the country at least one competing telegraph company to provide service to New York City. Now, this is a really important issue because if you are an advocate of market preserving federalism, the idea is that to get the best economic policy, one of the conditions is you have local governments handle most economic policy, and that those policies are going to, if they're bad, lead to people leaving that area, whether it's money leaving the area to invest elsewhere or people physically moving out. And local governments are going to have to compete to have the inputs to thrive. But that's only going to work if there's a common market amongst local governments. Well, if the rules in local governments no longer just affect what takes place in your local area, but in neighboring local governments, this undermines the common market, and it therefore undermines market preserving federalism. So let's talk about the preemption of these entry barriers, because these local telegraph entry barriers, and these entry barriers can be taxes, these entry barriers can be permission to operate, these entry barriers can be outright monopoly grants to a single company, whether they're done through straightforward documents, like the Pensacola Telegraph Company, which was the only company allowed to serve Pensacola, or they're done through more informal means, such as you have to get permission to put lines here. We just never give you permission to build your lines. They still have the same result. They're creating entry barriers, not just in that locality, but then they're going to affect messages in all the neighboring localities. So if we're going to preserve market preserving federalism, we want to preempt them. And in 1866, we have what's called the Post Roads Act. And it's a federal grant that gives companies the right to construct, maintain, operate a telegraph line along any post road in the United States. Now, the wording here doesn't really tell you how strong this law is. What the wording is really going to tell us, especially when to go through court interpretation, is that the federal government's saying that if something's designated a post road, which happens to be every road in the United States and every railroad by default, no one can tell you you have the right to be there. You have to pay for it. You don't get it for free. So if someone owns the land, you have to pay them. But you can't have a state government say, sorry, state doesn't give you permission to be here. So, when Nevada passed this monopoly law, for a little bit, it's in effect. But eventually a telegraph company says, I want to build in Nevada. And I have this federal grant that says I'm allowed to build, operate, and maintain a telegraph company. So I'm going to use it. And the court said, yeah, right, but you just have to make sure you pay for it. You can't take people's land. This is not a grant to just take people's land, but it's a franchise grant that allows you to exist as a company. So after this act, we're going to see evidence that there is competition. Now, it doesn't mean we have definitive evidence that this act created the competition, but there's a lot of historical accusations by some historians that there is no competition present in the United States once Western Union reaches a series of mergers in 1866. So we're going to see prices get driven down. We're going to see that the Down Telegraph firm gets challenged repeatedly during this time period. So one way we see that is there's going to be arbitrage opportunities.
I'm really sorry about the noises. Probably some student forgot to turn off the microphone.
Let's see.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I'll pause for a moment because I think I have the ability.
You can pause for a moment, and I'll let them.
Well, I can start muting stuff too, I think. Mute. Let's see,
okay.
let me mute, 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 mute. All right, I was able to mute most of them. There we go. All right.
I think you can start.
Okay. So one of the things that I've worked very hard on is digging up empirical data to show that there is some competitive pressure in this market, that this is not a market where Western Union can just do what it wants to do with no consequences. And one of the early ways we see that empirically is this opportunity to engage in arbitrage. So generally speaking, Western Union serves more locations than our telegraph companies. Our telegraph companies are typically serving the largest cities, and Western Union is serving both the large cities and surrounding towns and villages. Western Union's prices had worked out where the prices in larger cities are less than those other locations. Okay, well, that's not necessarily a surprise, right? Because you have competition between those large cities. And it's feasible too that the cost of those other locations are higher. But then you notice this peculiarity. So if you assume that the price from New York City to a hub city, a large city, is likely a competitive price, then because that's where competition's at, then New York City to a destination, Western Union may not be worried about competition. And that was a mistake, because what the competition figures out is that they could send a price, they could send a telegram from New York to a hub city and then forward it using the local telegraph rate from that hub city to the destination for less than what Western Union was charging. In fact, if you had a friend who lived in the hub city, say Chicago, you could send a message from New York City to Chicago and have them send that message on Western Union's own telegraph lines for less than if you told Western Union to send it directly. And if we look here, these are all these potential arbitrage opportunities. Every dot you see is a situation where if you had a friend in those hub cities, so the hub cities are in green, you could have sent a message to that hub city and then forwarded on through an intermediary for a lower price. Now, if you lived in New York City, your intermediary was not likely a friend. It was you sent a message on a competing telegraph company's lines, and then that competing telegraph company would take that message to the Western Union office and forward that message on. By 1873, Western Union figures this out. And at that point, Western Union changes all their prices systematically. They reduce the prices in those surrounding areas so that it doesn't cost less to send a message on Western Union's own line to those hub cities and resend it. So they destroy that arbitrage opportunity in response to this competitive threat. A situation where we have really good price data, where you can see the pressure in Western Union, was when it faced a new competitor called Postal Telegraph Commercial Cable. They engage in a price war, in particular over sending international messages. So prior to this new competitor entering the marketplace, the price to send an international message from New York City to London was 50 cents a word. Postal Telegraph Commercial Cable, they come into the market in 1884. And Postal Telegraph Commercial Cable is reliant on the protections from the 1866 Post Roads Act. In particular, because they have to build not just this cable underneath the ocean, but to get all the messages that they'll be sending on that cable, and they need to be able to distribute those messages throughout the rest of the United States. So they also build a domestic telegraph network that's reliant on the protections in the Post Act to not be inhibited by local governments and state governments. Post Telegraph drops their price, Western Union drops their price. And Western Union says, you know what? Let's make this really competitive. Western Union drops the price to 12 cents a word. So roughly, the telegraph price becomes 20% of the previous telegraph price to send this message. And eventually, Postal Telegraph Commercial Cable matches them. Now, this price war, it does end. July 31st, 1880, they do enter into a price fixing agreement. They do agree that the price will be 25 cents a word. Is that a form of collusion? Yes. But that price is half what the price was prior to Postal Telegraph Commercial Cable entering the market. The pressure from this one firm dramatically lowers the price. And their ability to put that pressure on them, in part, is dependent on the protections they have to have that domestic network across the country to follow messages to New York City so they can forward them on. Now, there might be some concerns that this didn't happen everywhere, but if you look at states, you're going to see similar stories. So right here, you're seeing the Western Union telegraph price to London from other parts of the United States. And you're going to see dramatic reductions in price. And generally speaking, even after the price fixing agreement, it's roughly around half what the price was prior to the competition. Now, there might be concern that we're not seeing positive welfare effects. But because here we're seeing this dramatic drop in revenue being received by Western Union and by its cable partners. But with a back of the envelope estimate, we're not just seeing a drop in prices. We're not just seeing a drop in revenue. We are seeing at Western Union alone, large increases in total number of telegraphs handled. So using the numbers from Western Union alone, we're seeing an increase in consumer welfare. And that's not accounting for the increase in messages being handled by its competitor, Postal Telegraph and commercial cable. The other place where we really see pressure in Western Union is this great example when American Union Telegraph starts competing with them in the late 1870s. 1879 to be exact. Now, we don't have good price data for this time period, but what we do have is we have daily stock prices. And what I was able to do is I was able to conduct an event study to see what was the effect of this entrance in the price war. So I was able to date when American Union is claimed to have dropped their prices. And we can see in the stock price for Western Union, a large, significant decrease in price around the time of the event. We're talking, almost 10%, which for an event study in stocks is ridiculously large. And we see when this ends, that Western Union stock significantly recovers. And the ending of this price war is not, in a weird way, not actually showing that competition didn't work. The way this price war ends is that the American Union Telegraph was so successful competing against Western Union, they actually took over Western Union. So you had a complete change in who owned and managed Western Union. They keep the Western Union name, it's a stronger brand. And it makes some of the legal issues with contracts easier. But it shows that if Western Union, the dominant firm at this time period, is not doing its job, new entrants can enter the marketplace. New entrants can do enough damage that they, in essence, become the new manager of the telegraph system. So you have pressure to provide a certain level of quality telegraph services. Because if you don't, we see repeatedly, someone will challenge you. And generally speaking, with a few exceptions here and there, 1866 onward, there's usually at least one other national challenger to the Western Union system. And those challengers are pushing Western Union to provide better services that we can demonstrate through numbers like this, where it's an event study, lower prices, changes in pricing structure. So I really want to bring us back to the title, which is why study the telegraph? Because the telegraph is a moment in time of a technology that really changes how people and businesses do things. There's lots of innovations that are based on the telegraph, not just the ones we've mentioned. Now, we could talk about the importance of the telegraph system to weather forecasting, which is going to impact not just knowledge of what you should dress that day, but it's going to impact people like farmers. It's going to change how society interacts with each other. I can make last minute changes on how I'm going to travel, and I can let other people know what's going to happen before it happens, before I arrive there and surprise them. Even just in your social lives, if you're dealing with an illness with a family member, you can now possibly get there in time to help them, either to help them recover while they're still sick, or at least see them again before they die. It allows new possibility for collective actions. Now, we've seen evidence in the temperance movement. We've seen evidence involving lynching. There's a lot of potential for additional research in that area. And in some ways, it can make institutions stronger. There's research out there. Jeremy Atack's involved, and I messed Jeremy's last name up. Jaminski, I believe. Yeah. Where, while they haven't been able to separate the effect of the railroad of the telegraph, there's potential evidence that access to that communication network, whether it's the railroad or the telegraph, resulted in banks being more disciplined in managing their reserves to make less risk, to make themselves more solvent in case there was a bank run or an economic downturn. Like almost all new technologies, provision of technology is going to be tied to the government some way, somehow, in the end. Whether it's doing with liabilities, whether it's doing with interacting with pre-existing institutions, whether it's just doing with the challenge, again, especially in a republic or a democracy where rent seeking is part of the game. How do you navigate that? How do you preserve economic efficiency? Can you preserve economic efficiency, or how close can you get to it? Should this service be provided by the government? Should this service be provided by private businesses? And it really pushes you to think. When you're thinking about having market power, even in an industry that has market power, you can still put some discipline in that sector by having less regulation. If you can identify regulation that's really adding to the sunk cost of that industry, that lowers the potential for the competitors, you can still encourage, promote competition by getting rid of it. And that competition can further discipline an incumbent firm. Now, does it mean it's perfectly going to be the result of perfect competition? No. But expecting perfect competition may not be a reasonable expectation. And when you're making your trade-offs from a policy perspective, are you going to have more success creating what competition can exist? Or are you going to have more success trying to impose a bunch of regulations to try to simulate the effect of competition? Whether we're talking about price regulations, potentially maybe some interchange regulations, specific local regulations, how you must do things. Now, the telegraph is a place where these bigger questions we can explore. We can really explore the importance of communication, good communication and bad communication on our lives, and how the government's involvement can facilitate or make it worse in being able to improve our lives or not. And that our options are larger than we may think. There is a role for competitive pressure even in a high sunk cost industry.